I heard her say I was a useless burden, those exact words, and she wasn't whispering either. My future daughter-in-law stood 10 feet away from me at the edge of the vineyard, sipping champagne, laughing with her mother, and casually referring to me like I wasn't even human. My name is Linda. I'm 66 years old, a retired English teacher, and I raised my son alone after my husband passed away when Jason was just 8. I thought I'd done a decent job. I thought being there for every school play, every late-night illness, every single parent-teacher conference would count for something. But apparently, it didn't. Not to the woman he was marrying. Not to the family that looked at me like I was a charity case dressed in discount department store clothes. I stood there in my modest blue dress, holding a gift I'd spent weeks saving for, and realized I was no longer someone they respected. I was just someone they tolerated. I wish I could tell you I confronted her then and there, that I made a scene or threw my drink in her face. But I didn't. I just stood still, like my feet had taken root in the gravel path, and my throat locked up, like it was trying to protect me from saying something I'd regret. And in that silence, something broke open inside me. Not rage, not sadness, something colder, clearer, a realization that I had spent so long being quiet for the sake of peace, I'd forgotten what it felt like to speak for myself. This is the story of the moment I remembered who I was, and why I decided I would never be invisible again. The wedding was held at a vineyard in Napa that looked like it had been pulled straight from a luxury bridal magazine. Rows of lavender lined the stone paths, and white roses spilled out of massive arrangements on every table. A string quartet played something classical that I couldn't name. But it sounded expensive, and that seemed to be the theme of the day. The guests arrived in sleek black cars and stepped out, wearing custom suits and gowns that shimmered in the California Sunday. The woman had that polished look, perfect hair, quiet diamonds, the kind of poise that comes from never worrying about rent. I stood off to the side in a dress I'd bought on sale at Macy's, the same shoes I wore to church, holding a small clutch that had seen better days. Jason looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, but he barely glanced in my direction when I waved. His bride, Rachel, was glowing, all lace and satin and elegance, surrounded by bridesmaids who looked like they belonged on the cover of a fashion catalog. I smiled for the photos when asked, stood where I was told, and tried not to notice that I was the only one without a designer handbag or a professional blowout. The seating chart placed me at a table near the back, next to a pair of Rachel's distant cousins, who spent most of dinner talking about ski properties and hedge funds. I nodded politely, sipped my sparkling water, and tried to make my chicken last longer than it needed to. No one asked where I was from. No one asked what I did before I retired. I might as well have been part of the decor. What hurt more than being ignored by strangers was the way Jason didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. He floated from table to table, charming everyone, laughing with Rachel's family, clinking glasses in perfect sync with the photographer's cues. I kept waiting for a moment that felt like mine, just a few seconds to feel seen by the son I raised. It never came. Every time I looked at Rachel's parents, I saw the life she came from, and the one Jason was marrying into. Clean lines. Prestige. Expectations. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, and I wasn't just talking about the French names on the wine bottles. They had money, but more than that, they had comfort. The kind that seeps into your voice, your posture, your smile. I didn't resent them for it. I just didn't know how to exist beside them without shrinking. I spent most of my adult life making sure Jason had food on the table, books for school, and clean clothes, even when I had to skip a meal to afford them. I thought those things mattered. But sitting at that table, surrounded by strangers and luxury I couldn't relate to, I started to wonder if I'd been kidding myself. I hadn't meant to overhear them. I was standing just outside the tasting room, trying to find a quiet corner to get a breath of fresh air, away from the clinking glasses and carefully choreographed smiles. That's when I heard Rachel's voice float through the open terrace doors, sharp and certain, the way only someone with confidence in their place in the world can speak. She was standing beside her mother, adjusting her veil in the reflection of the window glass. I only caught the tail end of the sentence, but it landed like a punch to the chest. She said I was useless. that I had nothing to offer, and then she laughed. Her mother didn't correct her. She didn't flinch. She nodded, as if they were discussing the quality of the flower arrangements or the predictability of the weather. I stood there, frozen behind the stone archway, not daring to move or breathe, afraid that if I made a sound, I'd break completely. My cheeks burned, not from embarrassment but from something deeper, shame, the kind that settles into your bones when you realize someone you welcomed into your family sees you as disposable. I wanted to believe I'd misheard, that the wind had twisted the words, but I hadn't. Her tone was too clear. Her words were too deliberate. I thought about all the times I'd made room for Rachel in our lives, how I'd helped Jason plan the proposal, offered family recipes when she asked, pretended not to notice when she rolled her eyes at my suggestions. I'd convinced myself it was a generational difference, not disdain. I was wrong. Somewhere behind me, a server walked by, carrying a tray of miniature desserts, and the smell of burnt sugar suddenly made me nauseous. I backed away slowly, keeping my face neutral for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. I didn't want to cause a scene. I just wanted to disappear before the tears came. Inside, the music swelled, and people cheered as the newlyweds took another round of photos. Outside, I leaned against the side of the building and gripped the edge of the stone wall, grounding myself in something solid. My heart pounded, but not from rage. From something colder, the realization that I had just been reclassified. Not as a guest, not even as family, but as a burden. I wasn't angry yet, that would come later. In that moment, all I felt was small, unwelcome, like an afterthought standing in a world I no longer belonged to. Is this really how they see me? Tucked deep in the side pocket of my purse was an envelope I hadn't opened in nearly 4 years. The paper was worn soft at the edges, the corners slightly curled, but the handwriting across the front was still clear. Daniel had written my name with the same care he used when labeling our Christmas boxes or leaving notes on the fridge when he went to his early chemo appointments. He gave it to me 3 weeks before he died, after one of those long, quiet evenings where we didn't say much but still knew what the other was feeling. He'd looked at me with tired eyes and said, "If there ever came a time when someone made me feel small or worthless, I should read it. Not to remember him, but to remember myself." I hadn't wanted to believe I'd ever need it. I kept it anyway, tucked away like a talisman, more out of respect than expectation. But standing at my son's wedding, feeling invisible in a sea of silk and champagne, I realized that moment had come. I slipped away from the noise and found a bench under an old olive tree behind the reception tent. My hands shook as I broke the seal. The air smelled like roses and expensive perfume, but I hardly noticed. All I could think about was Daniel's voice in my head, steady and gentle, reminding me who I was before the world tried to tell me otherwise. The letter wasn't long, but every word landed like a hand placed gently on my back, guiding me forward. "If they ever make you feel like you don't matter," he wrote, "promise me you won't let them decide that for you." Daniel's handwriting was shaky but still familiar, each word carefully formed, like he knew this might be the last time his voice would reach me. He didn't waste space on pleasantries. He got straight to what he wanted me to know. He had noticed how Rachel spoke about family, how she asked questions about our finances with a little too much interest, and how Jason seemed to echo her priorities more and more as the wedding planning went on. He reminded me of what happened to his mother after his father died, how the family convinced her it was time for assisted living, dressed it up as safety and convenience, and then quietly signed over control of everything she had. She was gone within a year, not from illness, but from the grief of being managed. Daniel's words were soft, but they hit like thunder. Don't let anyone decide for you what your life should look like, Linda. Especially, not out of convenience. As I read, my heart sank with every line, not just because he'd seen this coming, but because I hadn't. He had been watching from his hospital bed, putting together a puzzle I didn't even know existed. And somehow, in his last days, he had the clarity to write it down for me. It wasn't just a letter. It was a lifeline. A reminder that I wasn't imagining things, that what I felt, the dismissal, the quiet exclusion, was real. I folded the paper slowly, holding it in my lap like something sacred. Daniel had given me permission, not just to feel hurt, but to push back. And in that moment, sitting under a tree at my son's wedding, I understood what I had to do. They had nearly finished the toasts when I realized I was never going to be mentioned. One after another, Rachel's family stood and spoke words about legacy, about strength, about the beautiful future she and Jason were building. Even Jason stood, thanked her parents, the guests, the venue, the vendors, and the universe. But not me. No one said my name. Not once. I sat at my table with my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying not to let my face show what my heart was screaming. Then something shifted. I don't know if it was Daniel's voice echoing in my mind or the sting of being made invisible in front of 200 people, but I stood up and I walked toward the microphone. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't look at Rachel or Jason. I just stepped onto the small stage and took the mic from the best man, who smiled awkwardly and stepped aside. The crowd fell quiet. Most didn't know who I was. That was about to change. I smiled, congratulated the couple, said the usual lines about love, partnership, and the beauty of commitment. Then I took a deep breath and pulled a folded piece of paper from my purse. I said I wanted to share something from someone who couldn't be here today, but whose words still mattered. And I began to read Daniel's letter. Every syllable rang through the speakers like a bell. His warnings about being erased, his observations about Rachel's curiosity over money, his fear that I might be pushed aside under the guise of being cared for. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I just let Daniel speak. By the time I finished, you could have heard a wine glass drop on the stone floor. Rachel's face had drained of all color. Jason stared at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. And for once, the room wasn't full of power or status or show. It was full of truth. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back in my purse. Then I looked straight at Jason and said that Daniel had always believed I was worth listening to, and that maybe it was time others did too. I thanked the guests for letting me share something personal, nodded to the stunned MC, and walked off the stage as the silence settled in behind me. It wasn't dramatic. No one shouted. No one clapped. But I felt something click back into place inside me. Not revenge, not righteousness, just a quiet certainty that I had finally stopped asking for space in my own story. I had taken it. Jason found me the next morning at the little motel just outside town. He didn't call ahead or text, just showed up at my door with dark circles under his eyes and a paper bag of coffee that had gone cold by the time I opened it. He didn't try to defend anything. He sat down on the edge of the chair and said he was sorry, that he hadn't realized how far he'd drifted from the person who raised him, that he let Rachel's version of success convince him mine wasn't enough. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to see if he meant it. His voice cracked when he said it wasn't just the letter that got to him. It was the fact that I stood there and read it anyway. I told him I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger takes energy, and I'd already spent too much of mine trying to be enough for people who never asked what I needed. But I did tell him this. I love you. I will always be your mother. But I'm not here to be managed, pitied, or kept quiet for the sake of anyone's comfort. If you want me in your life, it won't be as a silent seat at the table. It'll be as a full person, with boundaries, with value. I said it calmly. The way you speak when you finally stopped apologizing for existing. He nodded. Slowly. Like he was just starting to understand the weight of it. And maybe, finally, ready to carry some of it himself. 2 weeks after the wedding, I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. I hadn't painted since college, but something about mixing colors and watching them bloom across the page made me feel alive again. I wasn't good at it, but that wasn't the point. I also started writing short stories, mostly little vignettes about women who'd been overlooked, pushed aside, or underestimated. Every time I finished one, I felt lighter, like I'd taken back a piece of something I didn't know I'd lost. I even booked a train trip up the coast by myself. No schedule. No itinerary. Just me, a notebook, and the open window. I stopped waiting for invitations to be included and started inviting myself into the life I wanted. I wore colors that made me feel bold. I laughed louder. I stopped saying yes when I meant maybe and no when I meant nothing. For the first time in decades, I was no longer living on pause, waiting to be needed. I live for me now, and it feels like I finally remembered how to breathe. 8 months passed before I saw them again. Jason called one afternoon and asked if they could come by. He didn't say much, just that Rachel wanted to talk and that it wasn't about the wedding. I agreed, but I made sure to meet them at a cafe, not at my home. That was the first quiet boundary I set. Rachel looked different. Softer, maybe. A little tired. She was pregnant, showing just enough to hold her stomach every few minutes, like she was still surprised by it. They sat down across from me, fidgeting with their coffee lids, unsure how to begin. It was Rachel who finally spoke. She said she was sorry, that she hadn't understood what it meant to bring someone into your family and then treat them like they didn't matter, that she'd learned a lot in the past few months about what kind of mother she wanted to be and what kind of example she didn't want to become. Jason didn't add much. He just nodded, eyes glassy, and said he hoped we could start again. They wanted to know if I'd be involved in their child's life, if I had advice, if I were willing to help. I took a breath before answering. I said I was honored, they asked. That's yes, I'd love to be part of this new chapter, but on one condition. I will be present, I told them. Not as a token grandma, but as a whole person with boundaries. I will not be a background character in someone else's version of family. If I'm here, it's as me, with a voice, with space, and with the understanding that love only works when it's rooted in respect. They nodded. This time, they listened, not just to the words, but to the meaning behind them. Rachel reached across the table, gently touched my hand, and said they understood, that they wanted to do better. I believed them, not because they said the right things, but because they finally asked the right question. What do you think, Linda? That was all I needed. Not control, just consideration, just to matter. At the end of our painting class last week, the instructor asked us to share something about ourselves. Most people spoke about colors or technique. I spoke about my year of learning how to take up space again. Someone asked if I had any regrets. I smiled and said, only that I waited so long to believe that my voice mattered. The room went quiet for a moment. The kind of silence that doesn't feel awkward, just full, like people were letting the words land. That night, I went home and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I started writing a letter, not to Jason, not to Rachel, but to the grandchild I hadn't met yet. I wrote about what it means to stand tall when the world tells you to shrink, about how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. I told them that legacy isn't about houses or money or names carved into plaques. It's about moments, choices, the quiet courage to say, I am here, and I matter. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into the back of my favorite book. Someday, they'll find it. And when they do, I hope they read it and feel something strong stir inside them. Not fear, not pressure, just a possibility. Because that's the gift I want to leave behind. Not things, but the reminder that you always have the right to live a life that feels like your own.